The Dollarman Bandits are back. Hello, everybody. It is me. It is Orn, and I have a really great interview for you today. It's part of sort of a double feature this week about Sherlock Holmes. Today's episode focuses on one of my favorite writers, one of the most creative guys in the comic industry, Mike Barron. Mike is working on a Sherlock Holmes book. You could tell from speaking to him, he loves Sherlock Holmes. He's done his research on Sherlock Holmes, and I'm not going to say too much, but he's tying in a character from another very famous piece of literature into this book as well, which I think is absolutely genius. I love when he talked about how that works together and how these two blend so well to make the story happen. I can gush on about Mike. I think he's one of the best writers out there. I'm a huge Badger fan. But without further ado, Mike Barron talking Sherlock Holmes. We're talking to Mr. Mike Barron. Sir, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure, Oren.
So, you have a new project in the works that you've announced. You're taking on the most famous detective of all times, Sherlock Holmes. How did this project start?
About 3 years ago, I don't know why, I felt like watching some Sherlock Holmes movies. So I started watching as many movies as I could. There are far more Sherlock Holmes movies than I can watch in my lifetime. There probably more than anyone can watch in their lifetime. But I'm watching all these movies, and then about 2 years after that, I said, "Well, I think I'll just do a Sherlock Holmes story." And almost instantly, I thought, Captain Nemo. These two guys were meant to team up, and that's where the genesis of the story came from. It just kind of popped into my head.
What is it about Sherlock Holmes that's made this character last for so many years?
Uh, Partly it's his character, uh, and unique.
Mhm.
Uh, Partly it's the narrative voice, which is Victorian and unmistakable. Uh, and by that, I think everybody's familiar with Sherlock Holmes understands what I mean. That or with Victorian literature in general. But if you're familiar with Victorian literature, you're familiar with Sherlock Holmes, and you know that the way they spoke uh, in Victorian England uh, was it wasn't slang. It wasn't the easy speech we have today. It was with a degree of circumspection and circumlocution that we find alien. And by that I mean uh, they didn't look at things too closely because it would not be polite. And the perfect example, I always love this phrase. When the guy says, "Good day, sir." I said, "Good day." Everybody knows what that means. It means get the hell out of here. But you can't say that in Victorian England.
Mhm.
And it's a perfect example of what I mean by the Victorian voice. And along with the Victorian voice, there's this class consciousness that permeates everything done in that era. And nobody really questions the class consciousness. Sure, there were Marxists around at the time,
Mhm.
but not in a Sherlock Holmes story. So you always have the stableman tugging at his forelock and say, "Right away, sir, I'll get right on that, sir." And then you have Sherlock. And a lot of modern people agree that he suffered from Asperger's syndrome,
Mhm.
which is an inability to forge close human relationships and an uneasiness with human emotion.
Mhm.
And it's often compensated for by abilities in other areas. And of course, in Holmes' case, it was compensated for by his incredible observational abilities and ability to draw deductions from them. Now, as he went along, he learned to care about people through his cases uh, because he learned to care about the people who needed his help if they were worthy. And he recognized that these were good people and he was doing a good thing for them. So he was able to overcome that hesitancy with emotional closeness eventually. And it didn't come easy for him. But the other thing is, of course, there's no character in literature quite like him. He's probably the most famous fictional character of all time. And that's all due to Conan Doyle's invention. And it's important to note that the stories are all narrated. by
Mhm.
Dr. Watson,
Right.
who was a Victorian gentleman,
Mhm.
uh, from his boots to the top of his top hat. Uh, and he's always mindful of that in the language that he chooses. Uh, there's no swearing, there's no cursing. It's all very careful, and sometimes it's obliquely stated,
Mhm.
which makes it hard sometimes to envision exactly what's going on. But not for me. And one of the reasons is there's a case I recently read, a Sherlock Holmes story called The Case of Mistaken Identity. And it's about this young woman who's about to get married. And every time her father disappears, her fiance shows up. Now, her father is bald, and the fiance's got bushy sideburns and a mustache and a full head of hair. And when I read that, it took me about 2 seconds to realize that it was her father posing as her fiance. And then he stiffs her on wedding day. And so she goes to Holmes, and it takes Holmes about 2 seconds to figure it out, too, that the father is doing this because he controlled the young lady's estate. And if she got married or she left him, he
Mhm.
would no longer control that estate. So he was going to disappear forever and then marry his own daughter so that he could control the estate, or else leave her stranded at the altar so that she would never again consider marriage. And it's a funny story. It's a story that could only take place in the Victorian era
Right.
because the woman did not look too closely at her paramour, because if she did, she'd realize it was her father.
As a writer, are you taking your thoughts and saying, okay, this is what I want to do? How do I put this into a Victorian way of thinking, a Victorian way of speaking? Or have you just read so much Sherlock Holmes and watched so much that when you're thinking about him, it's coming out in that voice?
The latter. I
Okay.
think that all Holmes aficionados do that. They absorb the voice until it seems natural to them. I've
Mhm.
been reading Sherlock Holmes all my life, and then started binge watching all these movies,
Mhm.
which for the most part uh, stick closely to the narrative style. Now, there are exceptions to that, like the American TV show Elementary, which recasts Holmes as an American and recasts Dr. Watson as Lucy Liu. I've watched it. It's very well done. It's what we call a Holmes homage, which is what they call any Sherlock Holmes story not written by Conan Doyle. But in this case, I don't think that anybody's going to mistake it for Sherlock Holmes. It's not Sherlock Holmes. It doesn't stay true to his character, the Canaan, and we see it as what it is, a modern interpretation of Holmes. The same with Robert Downey Jr.'s Holmes. Now, I watched those movies and I enjoyed them, but not for 1 second did I think that this was Conan Doyle's Holmes. This was like Charles Bronson playing Holmes. Well, no,
As
I mean, Downey is no great brawler like Charles Bronson is, but there was a much greater emphasis on action because that's what uh, Guy Ritchie does.
and Holmes is it's an emphasis on intelligence and taking notice of certain things. When you're
Right.
crafting this story, how are you saying I want to put my spin on it, but I want to pay homage to the great stories that are out there? How did you find a way to kind of mix them both together?
Well, it was easy. For one thing, I've absorbed the Victorian language, so I was able to write it. And remember, I'm not writing a novel here,
Right,
although many people have,
right.
and a lot of them have nailed it as well. I was writing a graphic novel, so that although there's a lot of dialogue, a dialogue is very important to comics and graphic novels. Whenever we've all seen wordless comics,
Mhm.
I, they don't work. They don't work because they're not taking full advantage of the medium. You read the wordless comic, it takes 5 minutes or 15 minutes if it's a graphic novel, and you think nice art, and then you forget it immediately because it's the words and the context of the pictures that make the comic work. Um, Also, I was plugged into that Victorian era where it saw an outpouring of fictional characters that have stayed with us forever. And naturally, they mix and match. And the proof of that is the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But there are so many other examples, like Philip Jose Farmer's Wold Newton universe. Philip Jose Farmer one of my favorite science fiction writers, and he mixed and matched characters from real life with fictional characters all the time. He featured Sir Richard Francis Burton, he featured Mark Twain, and he mixed them up with Victorian characters that were fictional. He also went on to write the definitive biography of Lord Greystoke.
Mhm.
I think that's what he calls it, the definitive biography of Lord Greystoke. And he wrote his own spin on Tarzan and Doc Savage. He called them Lord Tiger and Doc Caliban.
Mhm.
And he mixed them up with Sherlock Holmes as well. So that's partly where the inspiration came. But mostly it was my idea that Holmes and Captain Nemo would make a terrific pair because, in a way, they're both outcasts.
Mhm.
They're both geniuses, and they both are fighting for cause they believe is right. Now, when Holmes first meets Nemo, gets picked up at sea. I don't want to go into too much to tell you
Right.
what's about the book, but Nemo says, once you board the Nautilus, you can never leave. And Holmes says, "Indeed, sir," but no, that's not what he says. But they get that resolved. They get that resolved. But that's part of Nemo's thing. You
Right.
know, it's Nemo against the world. He created the Nautilus to bring about world peace,
Mhm.
which seems counterproductive, but it's not, because the only thing that constrains dictators and uh, military adventurers is a greater military force. That's something we seem to have forgotten, or we don't want to confront that in the modern age.
Mhm.
And that's why these wars seem to go on forever,
Mhm.
because when you have a definitive winner, the war is over. Now, the cost of winning a war is horrendous, especially World War II. The cost of winning World War II, people don't understand how many hundreds of thousands of people died due to American bombing,
Mhm.
especially in Japan, uh, where the bombers were finally able to reach Tokyo. And in one 24-hour period, they killed 100,000 people. That's much more than the atomic bomb ever killed. And it
Mhm.
was the atomic bomb that convinced the Japanese to surrender. And it's a good thing they did, because if we'd been forced to invade Japan,
Mhm.
every Japanese citizen was prepared to fight to the death under the emperor's order, and they would have done that. Maybe a 5% would have refused to do it, but it would have meant millions dead. So the atomic bomb was necessary.
So for Nemo, who is, I think you described it a bit, but who is the man in your eyes? If you had to blueprint Nemo, what he is and how he came to be where he is now, how would you put him together?
Well, he's an outcast. He's a genius. Uh, People have hinted that Nemo was Indian. He came from the subcontinent of India.
Mhm.
Uh, I see him as mixed race. I don't necessarily see him as Indian, but of Southeast Asian
Mhm.
area. Uh, there's no story about how he grew up, but that's waiting to be told. It would be a fascinating book. But he builds the Nautilus, which is, an invention, a genius invention, and nobody else could even consider it. And it says in the book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, what's the source of the Nautilus power? He says it's electric,
Mhm.
and we can circle the Earth underwater without surfacing. And the only conclusion that we as modern people can come to is that he had a nuclear reactor aboard the submarine.
Right.
And in a way, that's kind of what Leviathan is about. It's
Mhm.
about a shipping magnate whose last two freighters from Argentina to England sank without a trace.
Mhm.
So he comes to Holmes and he says, "Mr. Holmes, will you find out what happened to them?" And Holmes says, I must turn you down, sir, because I don't go out on the water. I'm not an aquatic type of guy, and I don't want to be on the water." And the guy says, "I'll give you a Stradivarius violin." So Holmes changes his mind, and he and Watson agree to accompany the latest freighter as it sails from Liverpool to St. Petersburg.
Mhm.
with a cargo of rare ore for the Tsar. And the
Mhm.
reason the Tsar wants that rare ore is because he's hired a madman who's a genius on the level of Nemo, but much more sinister, uh, to attack his enemies from the sky and rain down these bombs. And he needs the ore to make the bombs, as well as to power this mysterious character's uh, airmobile.
Right. So you have these characters, and they're all their strengths, as we said a moment ago, is their intelligence, it's their drive, it's their focus to, achieve what they want to get done. How do you find the way to give all these characters sort of equal time in the book, or is this mainly just going to be focused on Holmes with some appearances by these other folks as well?
No, I get into their heads. A good writer, it's his job to imagine every point of view of every character in his book. And if you can't do that, you're not going to be a good writer.
Mhm.
And Nemo is just as fascinating to me as Holmes.
Mhm.
And it's not a question of apportioning who gets how many words and who gets how many pages. It's a question of growing the story organically out of the situation and their personalities so that everything that occurs seems natural to the reader. That doesn't mean it can't be a surprise, because it often is a surprise. I think that a writer has to surprise himself before he can surprise others. And I'm always surprising myself, especially when I do research. When you research something, like what precious ores are available in Argentina, you learn things which are going to affect the direction of the story, and you incorporate that into the story. So writing the story is a matter of being true to the precepts of drama. A story is a dynamic narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. By dynamic, I mean that the situation is constantly in flux. If the protagonist, say Sherlock Holmes, solved the problem on the second page, there would be no story. Or if he was perfectly happy, he wasn't anxious
Mhm.
when he did not have a case and he didn't need to shoot up cocaine, you wouldn't have Sherlock Holmes. So we have these problems, these imbalances,
Mhm.
which drive him to act and which drive the story. And it's just a sense of experience and imagination that allows you to write the story page by page so that everything seems natural in retrospect and interesting. That's the most important thing. Is, I have three rules as a writer. Number one is it's my job to entertain. And I never lose sight of that fact. A lot of people have recently, unfortunately. Number two is to show, don't tell. And that's just as important for straight prose as it is in a visual medium. But it's a visual medium in which we work. And by that, I mean that any information you can impart to the viewer or the reader visually, uh, without dialogue that advances the story, you should.
Mhm.
And third is to be original. And by that, I mean we're all unique human beings, so we necessarily bring our worldview and experience whatever it is that we write. But in this case, when I'm trying to channel
Mhm.
Conan Doyle, I try to bring Sherlock Holmes' experience and intuition into it. And because I've been reading it all my life and I've seen so many adaptations, I feel that I can do that.
When you thought about this story, did you have an end goal in mind, or did you have a beginning and you're going to see where it leads up to end the story?
Well, yes and no. At the end, Holmes must um, overcome the challenge through his wit, uh, because that's what the reader expects. And if it doesn't happen, that's not Holmes.
Mhm.
Uh, but at the same time, I believe that an ending should come as both a complete surprise and, in retrospect, inevitable. And you have to plant the seeds for that early. And when I want an example of that, I always look to the Planet of the Apes, the very first one, when they're going up the beach and they see the Statue of Liberty buried up to her waist.
Mhm.
And Charlton Heston breaks down, "No, you damn idiots." Uh, and he realizes that it was Earth all along. Now, a number of people probably figured that out the first time they watched it, but most didn't. They took the movie at face value that this was another planet on which he'd crash landed. But in retrospect, it was inevitable that it was Earth. And we look at that and say, of course it was Earth.
Right. And see, that's something I like so much about your work is it's the twists, it's the surprises, like I said. But with Badger, he could have been fighting someone and suddenly another personality kicks in and he's on the floor crying. You're
Right.
expecting this huge fight and it just stops. For you as a writer, are there certain books or certain projects you can look at now and say, these were evolutionary points for me? This is when I learned do this in the writing, do this in the writing, and it led to where you are now?
Well, yes and no. I always felt I could write comics.
Mhm.
And I created Nexus in 1981. And I'm still working on that character today. He's probably my favorite character, along with Badger. The whole body of Nexus, I'm proud of it. I think I nailed it from the beginning. And part of it was luck, part of it was skill, part of it was understanding the medium. But it took me 30 years to learn how to write a novel. And that's because I'm a slow learner. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago that I felt that I had it. I was writing, I had a bad period in my life for about 10 years where I couldn't get any work writing. And I took any job I could get, including janitor. And during that period, I moved from Wisconsin to Colorado, and I was taking odd jobs out here too. Uh, and then I decided, well, I'm going to try writing again. And I got back into it gradually. First with some graphic novels that some good friends offered to publish for me. And then finally with novels. And when I came back to novel writing, I was working on this book, and I suddenly realized I knew what I was doing and that I understood what was story, and I could see the whole story before me. And I thought, holy shit, I've got it. It took a long time, but when I get it, I get it.
Now, you mentioned something about Sherlock Holmes, which sometimes gets glossed over maybe in the movies and stuff like that. I know it was talked about a bit in Elementary, is that he did use drugs. I mean, I wouldn't say he was a full-blown addict, but he did use drugs. How
He
do you
was an addict.
was an addict? How
Yeah.
did how do you work that into a story and still make him seem like, the hero of it all?
Well, if it's on the very first page of the graphic novel. He's playing violin in his rooms when Mrs. Hudson comes in. Well, if you look closely, there's a syringe on the table.
Mhm,
Another fine example is the 7% solution,
mhm.
starring Nicole Williamson. He only did Holmes once, but he was brilliant. And in that one, Watson tricks him into seeing Sigmund Freud to see if Freud can get him off this lethargy and this addiction to cocaine. And of course, in the middle of their sessions, a case erupts, and so he and Freud team up to solve the mystery.
Do you think that, because when you've done other characters, Nexus, Badger, these are also people who have baggage. They're people who have, issues going on in their life. How do you sort of work that into the story and also keep the main storyline going?
Well, when I created the Badger,
Mhm.
where's
Well,
Mac? Where is she? There she is. I I, uh, I was fascinated by multiple personalities, and part of the inspiration came from a book called "The Minds of Billy Milligan," which was written by Daniel Flowers, who also wrote. Uh, wait. No, I'm getting no. It was. I have to look that up now. He wrote "Flowers for Algernon," which was
okay.
an award-winning science fiction novel.
Mhm,
But his book, Daniel Keyes,
mhm.
his book was one of the very first serious studies of multiples. And since then, there have been many. And I read it and I was fascinated by what he uncovered in that about Billy Milligan, who was one of the first multiples that somebody studied seriously. Now, when you suffer from multiple personality disorder, and psychiatrists have been unable to agree whether it's real or not forever. Sometimes it's real, sometimes it's not. But whatever that psychosis is, it's always caused by severe childhood trauma.
Mhm.
And I took that to heart. But for the most part, the Badger adventures are lighthearted
Mhm.
because the Badger's personality is off the wall crazy, and that's what makes it fun. And so the majority of those stories are off the wall crazy. Now we did do a serious one called The Shattered Mirror for Dark Horse, uh, in which I addressed exactly what happened to him. It was a very serious four-issue miniseries,
Mhm.
and there wasn't much humor in it, but it was real. And people who read it said, "Yeah, I get this now."
Mhm.
But one and done is all I need to do. I reference it from time to time when necessary because the Badger allows me to veer from mood to mood
Mhm.
uh, as I choose. For the most part, Norbert Sykes stays in the Badger persona because that's the one that's the most fun. But there are six other personas that he can go to. There's uh, a 7-year-old girl. Uh, there's a tough inner city black.
Mhm.
And of course, then there's Pierre, the psychotic French mass murderer.
Mhm.
And nobody wants to see Pierre, but occasionally Pierre is necessary.
Right. Or say, yeah, why do you think us readers as a culture, people like Sherlock Holmes, which led into the Private Eyes stories of the 30s and 40s, and that people who, while they follow the law and they're trying to solve crimes, but they're outside of the law, they're not police officers or FBI. Why do you think we've been so fascinated with these folks who are trying to do good but outside the law?
Well, in Holmes' case, he was always cooperating with the law and he was always a perfect gentleman.
Right.
And that was a natural outcome of what Conan Doyle had created because Holmes chose to cooperate with the police and they needed his help. It took a while for them to realize that, but Inspector Lestrade finally said, "Well, we better ask Holmes about this." However, uh, you're talking about the anti-hero, which really didn't come into being until the 20th century, mostly when Raymond Chandler created Philip Marlowe and Dashiell Hammett created the Continental Op. Now, Raymond Chandler uh, did the archetype of the tough talking private eye, the tarnished knight who down these mean streets must go,
Mhm.
and a lot of uh, Chandler's appeal is his language. I mean, he's one of those guys who wrote dialogue just popped and snapped. And one of the things that Marlowe said is from 20 feet away, she looked like $1 million.
Mhm.
From 10 feet away, she looked like a dame who'd been designed to be looked at from 20 feet away. And also, he was about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on angel food cake. And those, I mean, and there are hundreds of those things that Marlowe created, and it sticks with you. Yeah, this guy's a good writer. He's fun to read, and that's one of the reasons that we admire him now. And some of Marlowe's cases don't make any sense,
Right.
uh, like the Long Goodbye or the Little Sister. I mean, if you've ever seen what is that Humphrey Bogart movie? Let's find out. The Big Sleep.
Okay.
Have you ever seen it?
I think my dad was watching. I probably watched it with him when I was a younger kid.
I've watched it a couple of times.
Hmm.
Makes no sense. They never really solve it, but the dialogue just snaps and crackles, so it's very entertaining. And you can entertain in a lot of different ways, and one is with lively characters and great dialogue, and ultimately the movie doesn't have to make sense. I don't think Blade Runner really makes sense.
Right. Oh, I agree with that. What when you're doing this, what's the perfect villain for Sherlock Holmes? If you're building the perfect villain for him, what would these characteristics have to be?
Well, I don't think there is one perfect villain, but of course his bête noire, his ultimate villain is Professor Moriarty,
Yep.
who's a criminal genius in the way that Sherlock Holmes is a genius for justice.
Mhm.
And
What?
and that was necessary. As you know,
Mhm.
Conan Doyle got sick of Holmes
Mhm.
and tried to kill him off in his final problem, where he and Moriarty go over the falls. And then the publisher was Strand Magazine uh, said, "Mr. Conan Doyle, we are getting hundreds and hundreds of of letters from readers who are demanding more Holmes. We will pay you X amount to continue. So Conan Doyle says, "Oh, very well," and he went on to write a lot more stories.
Where does this rank as sort of favorite projects you've been a part of? Because it seems like you've been very passionate about Sherlock Holmes. You've done the research about it. I mean, you're still doing research about the details to go into this book. Where does this rank for you as projects you've worked on?
For the past 20 years, I don't let anything out of this house unless it's a home run. I have to believe in that character. I have to entertain. For me, a story has to snap and pop on every page.
Mhm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean action.
Right.
Sometimes it can be in the dialogue, and sometimes it can be done wordlessly without action. When a character takes time to breathe and reveal who he is by his actions. So it's a matter of experience and understanding story. Once you understand what constitutes story,
Mhm.
you don't make a wrong move. Well, what constitutes story? There's a million things, but the big three are: one, a fascinating character, Sherlock Holmes, most widely recognized fictional character in history. Number two, a fascinating situation, Jurassic Park. It's irresistible. We all love dinosaurs, and who's not interested in man messing with nature and creating a park where humans can interact with actual dinosaurs? What could go wrong, right? And three is a seductive narrative voice, and I point to Raymond Chandler as an example to that because I just quoted him for a couple of times. A seductive narrative voice can be more difficult in a visual medium than it can in strictly literary, but it's possible. And a lot of people have a seductive narrative voice. Frank Miller had it when he was writing Daredevil or The Dark Knight Returns.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think of movie directors who have a unique style, an unmistakable style. I mentioned Guy Ritchie before. He's not my favorite director because most of his movies are highbrow caper movies with witty dialogue, and they just don't ring true to me.
Right.
But a lot of people love him, and that's his seductive narrative voice. I mean, you could start watching a Guy Ritchie movie and not know it was him. You come in the middle and you'd say, this sure seems like a Guy Ritchie movie because you got uh, Jason Statham, for example, pulling off some elaborate caper,
Right.
and everybody's spouting witticisms, and it never gets too grim or horrible.
Mhm.
Uh, there's a lot of violence. It's usually bloodless. Uh, and there's a lot of intrigue and there's a lot of wealth on display. I mean, Guy Ritchie's done a bunch of movies where people are lounging in the playgrounds of the millionaires and about to pull off a high class caper.
Right.
They're going to steal the crown jewels or whatever, and he's got a million moving parts.
So from what you just said, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the past 20 years, would you say is the best you've been as a writer?
Yes,
Wow.
and that's a good thing,
No.
because I think a writer can keep improving throughout his age, and a lot of people have. A lot of people uh, they didn't really start writing. Edgar Rice Burroughs was 43 before he wrote Tarzan. He'd bounced around from job to job. He'd been fired from a lot of jobs. He didn't know what he was going to do next. And then these pulp magazines sprang up, and he said, "Well, I think I'll try my hand at writing for them."
Right.
And he just happened to hit the bullseye with Tarzan. It was a character that people were waiting for. They just didn't know it.
Do you think writing books that are your pure ideas and not characters that belong to other companies helped you as a writer?
I don't know. I've worked on other people's characters,
Mhm.
and I've enjoyed it. I wrote a destroyer novel,
Right.
and I'm very proud of that. And I wrote a Witchblade novel, and I'm proud of that. But those were more than 20 years ago. No, not the destroyer, but the Witchblade was like 30 years ago. Uh, and I kept learning, and now I think I'm at a point where I have a narrative voice. It's not noticeable. I'm one of those guys that strives for uh, uh, an invisible narrative voice. And by that, I mean, I want the reader to experience the story by reading it and living it and not thinking about the words. And I think the greatest example I can think of like that is Michael Connolly. I love his work. He's the Los Angeles crime writer. He was a newspaper reporter for many years. He's got two enduring characters, Bosch,
Mhm,
Detective Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch,
mhm,
and the Lincoln lawyer, uh, uh, Mickey Holler.
mhm,
Uh, and they've both been turned into TV series, and both the series are outstanding. And the reason that each season of that series is based on a novel, a good novel.
mhm,
And when you're reading Michael Connolly, you're not aware of the words at all. You are experiencing that story as it happens. It's a great trick. Well, I can't say few people have it because a lot of people have it. But he's the best example that I can think of. And I also like Stephen Hunter, but Stephen Hunter has a very strong narrative voice. I'm reading a book of his, uh, which is about uh, his sharpshooter uh, uh, protagonist, Bob Lee Swagger,
mhm,
who was a Vietnam veteran. Only this is features his father, Earl Swagger, who was a World War II veteran, and it's called the Bullet Garden. And it's about an area in Nazi Germany where Nazi snipers keep picking off allies one by one because they know the territory and they've got a few tricks.
mhm,
And Hunter sets the stage with this dialogue between this British guy and the Americans, which is so entertaining and which has such an unmistakable British voice to it. I wish I had that novel right here. It's downstairs so
mhm,
that I could quote to you from it because it's dialogue that's fun to read. And it's a I'm not saying it's self-conscious, but
mhm,
it's meant to be fun to read. You can tell that Hunter had a ball writing it, and you'll have a ball reading it.
mhm.
Uh, and You might think, wow, do they really talk like this? But it does ring of authenticity. It just rings of the authenticity of a brilliant conversationalist, and not everybody is a brilliant conversationalist.
So yes, Sherlock Holmes, as done by Michael Barron. Thrilled about this. Can't wait to check it out. Like I, said before, bringing Captain Nemo in. I love that because I love the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and this is sort of it touches on that, just bringing two different worlds together. And the way he's done it seems to make a lot of sense, and I can't wait to see how it all plays out. But you can tell at least by talking to him, like he's done the research, checked out the books, the movies, like the tone, the aspects of the character. Um, so it sort of pays homage to the original version of it. Please go check it out. It's definitely going to be worth your while. And Mike, thank you so much for coming on. I'm sure we'll be talking to you down the road. We love hearing what you have to say. Guys, thank you for checking out. And remember, this Friday, another episode coming out about Sherlock Holmes. This is Joe's doing this one. He hit this one out of the ballpark. I think you're going to love this as well. Just different ways to look at the same character, and I think that's a great thing, and that's what makes comics so wonderful. Everything's open to interpretation. So have a wonderful Wednesday, and we will see you soon.